So I'll start with a brief overview of the findings for this year, and I'll try and summarize some of the main findings that we found in this year's report. As Will mentioned, we've been publishing this survey. This is actually the 30th year of its publication. And this year we noted for the 8th year in a row continued declines in the level of press freedom around the world. Of the 196 countries and territories that we assessed for last year, we found that 69 or 35% were rated in our free category, 64 or 33% were rated partly free, and 32% were rated not free. This represented a modest decline from last year in the number of free, partly free, and not free countries. In terms of the breakdown of countries, it's actually a pretty even breakdown between the three categories, but when you look at population, it's a much more bleak assessment. This year we found that only 16% of the world's population live in countries with a free press, while 44% have a partly free press and 40% live in countries with not free media environments. And this was actually the lowest percentage in the free category since we started recording population data in 1996, so it's also a very worrying trend. In terms of the overall level of press freedom worldwide, as measured by the global average score, this worsened in 2009, and we also saw region-wide declines in almost every region, the worst in sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas, but also in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union and Western Europe. The Asia-Pacific region was the only region whose score overall improved, and this was really driven by improvements in several countries in South Asia. Looking at significant numerical shifts, which we measure as a 3 or more point change on a 0 to 100 point scale, which is how we measure the exact level of press freedom for each country, we noted that in 2009, declines outnumbered gains by a 2 to 1 margin. So in terms of countries either moving up or down the scale, there were many more declines than improvements in 2009. Looking at some of our overall trends, we found that these declines have been present in all types of media environments. So we see continuing issues in terms of authoritarian governments, such as Russia, China, Venezuela, and Iran, who have been consolidating or have consolidated control over the old media and are now cracking down as well on new media and the internet. We've seen declines in a number of important sort of mid-range countries, which actually have many other elements of democracy. So over the past 5 years and continuing this year, we've seen steady declines in countries such as Mexico in the Americas, Thailand, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka in Asia, and Senegal and Uganda in sub-Saharan Africa. We've also seen declines, as I've noted, in some of the much more authoritarian countries, and we've seen declines continuing this year in some very free media environments. We've seen continuing restrictions in countries such as Israel and Italy. Israel actually returned to free this year, but there are some continuing issues of concern. And in a very worrying development, 2 countries in southern Africa, Namibia and South Africa, slipped this year from the free into the partly free category, which is the first time since 1990 that there have been no free countries in South Africa, Southern Africa. Looking at some of the key reasons for the declines, we have noted that despite some positive movements in 2009, mostly in South Asia, as I said, the overall trend has remained very negative. And behind these deteriorations, we did note a few themes that can help to place these findings in context on a global scale. So continuing issues that we found were present last year. Many governments appear unwilling to reform or eliminate altogether an array of restrictive laws that are being used against journalists and news outlets, and some have been applying them with even greater determination. These include laws that forbid inciting hatred, commenting on sensitive topics such as religion or ethnicity, or endangering national security, which is a very broad term which can be applied against situations which is not really relevant. In addition, libel and defamation laws have also been commonly used to muzzle the independent media. Another key issue, which continues to be a main restricting factor on media freedom and a cause for decline, is a high murder rate against journalists and other crimes against journalists as well, other attacks, things like that, and the issue of continuing impunity for the people that carry out the murders and other attacks. So we've noted that, in certain countries, the level of violence and physical harassment is very, very high. Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia are some of the main countries of concern. And these are conflict zones where this is to be expected, one could say. But there are many other countries, many of them quite open and democratic, which have very high murder rates, such as Mexico, Russia, the Philippines, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. So murder and impunity is a key continuing factor for decline. In 2009 in particular, we saw that in a number of countries experiencing political and upheaval and conflict, media were really caught in the crossfire and became prime targets for threats and restrictions. The largest numerical decline of the year took place in Fiji, where they abrogated the constitution and imposed blanket censorship on media outlets. There were similarly sharp declines in Madagascar, as well as in Guinea, Niger, and Honduras, all countries which experienced larger political conflict. Another trend which continued from past years was but actually which intensified in 2009, was the focus on the internet and other forms of new media. In many countries, this is actually a more open environment for the media than the traditional print and broadcast media, but it's really becoming sort of a key place both to express opinions as well as for governments to crack down. So there's been continuing and intensified levels of censorship, manipulation of content, as well as physical harassment of individual bloggers and other people who are trying to publish online. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, bloggers and internet-based journalists now account for more cases of imprisonments than their counterparts in the traditional media. So this is really a new focus by many governments on this sphere. Finally, we've seen that in several different ways, the globalization of censorship, as we term it, represents a growing threat to freedoms of expression in the press. Cases of libel tourism have made the United Kingdom sort of a focus now for freedom of expression activists in terms of trying to overturn laws which allow, let's say, a complainant in one country to prosecute a media outlet in another country for something that they've written. Meanwhile, we've seen that organizations such as the Organization of the Islamic Conference have been trying to restrict speech by inserting anti-blasphemy provisions into international human rights covenants. And important and authoritarian countries such as China have been attempting to sort of export their model of restriction by trying to put pressure on, let's say, arts festivals, book fairs, and other cultural and scholarly venues in different countries to try and remove content or people that they do not want featured on these programs. I'll move now quickly to the worst of the worst. Our worst rated countries for 2009 are Belarus, Burma, Cuba, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Iran, Libya, and North Korea, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And in these countries, which are scattered pretty much around the globe, independent media are either non-existent or barely able to operate. The press acts as a mouthpiece for the regime. Citizens' access to unbiased information is severely limited, and dissent is usually crushed through imprisonment, torture, and other forms of repression. In 2010, Iran replaced Zimbabwe in this worst performing group of 10 countries. And finally, I'll try and place our findings in context a little bit. I can use the, okay. You'll probably have to look on the side panels. As I mentioned before, I think this year marks the 30th year that the Press Freedom Index has been produced. And the overarching trend over the last 30 years has been one of gradual and occasionally dramatic improvements in the level of media freedom worldwide. If you look at the map from 1980, there was a pretty grim global landscape for media freedom. Only 25% of the countries we covered at that time had free media, 22% had partly free media, and the majority were in the not free category. By 1990, let me see, these figures had shown a modest improvement, and by 2000 there actually had been a blossoming of press freedom. Of the 186 countries and territories we covered 10 years ago, 69 or 37% were rated free, 51 countries, 27% not partly free, and 66 or 35% rated not free. So there really was a dramatic shift from the not free into the partly free category in particular. However, we've seen that over the past decade, this positive momentum that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall has stalled and in some cases has been reversed. And despite significant structural changes in the media landscape, particularly including a significant diversification of information driven by the development of online media, as well as the expansion of cable and satellite television and the broadcast sector, our index has shown gradual declines in the level of media freedom on a global scale, with the most pronounced setbacks taking place in Latin America and the former Soviet Union, but in several other regions as well. And on a final note, just to point out that these declines are very worrying and require constant monitoring and vigilance, as well as significant resources being devoted to help overturn these negative trends. So on that grim note, I will turn it over to our panel to help tease out some of the issues and some of the themes that we'd like to focus on.